Well, folks, it seems like there's a lot of controversy on how the judges came to the conclusions that they did. So I just felt like, just jumping on here and saying some words and trying to kind of shed some light on how myself and the rest of the judges came to the conclusions that we did. Because, at the end of the day, I feel a lot of empathy for everyone that doesn't really understand how we come to that conclusion, because the majority of people are watching on a two-dimensional screen, and at the end of the day, it's almost impossible for people that are not there to actually understand all of the intricacies of each line and why one line is actually harder than the other, and how one line can be much more exposure than the other when you're watching it on a screen. When the screen, we've all heard how the screen never really shows things as they are, and it's even truer at an event like the Red Bull Rampage. And a good example of that is every single person that's watched it for years that finally gets their boots on the ground and walks up a Rampage venue, their eyes are just blown out of their sockets, because they're just so amazed at how much bigger and gnarlier everything is in person, rather than looking on a screen that they've been looking on for sometimes 10, 15 years. First of all, with an event site like this, we know the site very well. I know myself, I rode that venue, I have my own line there. I have, a bunch of experience riding those ridges, sending it off the top and whatnot. So for us, we go and we look at everyone's lines, and we actually measure every single takeoff to landing. And pretty much anything that's like, any of the bigger stuff is all measured, just so that we can cross-reference it to any of the other features. And then on top of that, we look at, okay, what kind of exposure is there coming into the feature? Do they have to brake really hard? Do they have like a really easy in-run with no exposure? How's the landing? Because sometimes the landings are really skinny and there's like a cliff on the side, like an actual wall on the high side, and then on the low side is like 50-foot cliff as well, right where you're landing. And then some landings are really manicured and buff, and you don't really have a lot of risk if you fall. So like all these different factors go into how we judge a line. And a lot of times, like the hot topic right now is Bienve, and how his score was so low, because everyone looks at, it's the big features that, prominently stick out in everyone's mind, and what everyone, focuses on for every reason. So for Bienve's run, his upper portion of his line was one of the mellowest ways to get off the top, and he didn't have a lot of speed on it, so he was riding it fairly timidly. And then as soon as he got roughly around the halfway mark of his run, he really turned it up. He flipped off the step down onto the lily pad, which was rad, and then he not finished off, but then he went into his front flip over the canyon gap. And at the end of the day, those three features were amazing, and they were over really big features. The canyon gap, I believe, is like 72, 73. I have to check my notes, but so tip to tip, it's one of the biggest. But keep in mind that canyon gap, the sight lines are really good. You're looking at everything when you're coming into it, and everything's super buff, manicured. You have a nice mellow in run, because you're coming off a drop, and obviously flipping into the lily pad is super nasty. But then he's got a really long run out into that, so he's got a lot of time to shut it down on the brakes if he doesn't want to hit it, and he's got a lot of time to check his speed and gauge how fast he's going. And then on the landing itself, the landing is super big and wide. It was one of the only features that the event actually pre-built for the riders, just because it's such a prominent feature, and there's just no way that athletes can take on a build like that. And then after that, he goes into a couple tricks down on the lower stuff. And I hope everyone knows that, this is a big mountain freeride event. And when you do a bunch of tricks down low on like dirt jump style features, you're not going to get rewarded very well versus doing those big tricks up high on the mountain where there's exposure. Which will bring me to some of my other points that I like to point out for people is that, seeing as it is a big mountain freeride event and not a slopestyle event, if you are doing your tricks up high on the ridges where there's a ton of exposure, you're going to get rewarded very well. And that was the case where athletes that were riding ridges that were skinny and had a ton of exposure, they definitely got rewarded. And then another piece of topic with us judges that we talked about in great depth was the battleship. Originally it was supposed to be Brendan and G hitting that, and unfortunately G took himself out in practice, and the battleship was by far the biggest amount of exposure we've ever seen at a Rampage course. The feature itself was quite a mellow feature. Like if you didn't have any exposure and that little skipper onto the battleship was in the forest without any cliffs beside it, it would just be, not a really nice jump or a little gap at all, because, the landing was like, 8 inches tall and it immediately went uphill. And that was due to the fact that the ridge was so skinny and just how the feature naturally was. You couldn't really make it any better. So therefore, the actual feature itself was very, not that hard to ride. But at the end of the day, if you screwed up at all and got bounced off on either side, the consequences were so severe that, us judges, we talked about it in great depth, and like, how do we judge this? Because you really don't have that tough of a feature, but the fact that there's so much exposure makes it insanely scary, and you really can't take away anything from the athletes if they're putting themselves at so much exposure. So, we had to judge that quite high, and we really felt Brendog really was rewarded with that as one of the gnarliest features for exposure on the entire mountain. And then flipping to Brendog's run, his canyon gap was, in our opinion, much gnarlier than the lower canyon gap that the Bienvenido front flipped, because the in-run coming in, which maybe not a lot of people actually saw, his in-run actually skipped over top of Brett Reeder's old line, which made it twice, maybe even 3 times as hard, because literally where the compression would be, where you're pumping for the lip, he actually had to have a downhill takeoff with a not the greatest landing to land in, and then pump and yank off in Brendog fashion, very skinny lip, to make it across this canyon. And that was very technical, and once again we rewarded him quite very high on his exposure level and his line choice. And then his trick score was not that high because he did a suicide over it. It's a pretty rad trick, but it's not that much exposure when you're it's one of the go-to tricks if you just want to nibble off a trick off a drop or a big gap. And then his flip on the step down, his step down definitely was a little tight and very technical, but it wasn't anywhere near the size of any of the other people's big flip step downs, which there was several of the guys doing big flip step downs. Obviously no one held a candle to Zinc step down, which still is the biggest flip step down in history on one of the biggest features ever hit in history. So I hope I could go into every single athlete and explain why, but I think for now, this is just like a pretty good recap of like, the two hot topics, which, it seems like in usual fashion, Brendog got robbed is usually a hashtag that gets thrown out quite often, and obviously BMB is, a fan favorite because, it's, you front flipped a canyon cap. That's amazing. It's rad. And a lot of people, I've even have several like family members, even ask me like, hey, how come, BMB didn't win? And, it's very simple to us, because when you're looking at it on a screen, you just can't understand what we're looking at from the judge's opinion. And at the end of the day, I have a lifetime of experience riding this event as a competitor, and I also have a lot of experience judging this event, and you guys just really need to rely on myself and my other judges, our knowledge and our skill of being in this industry and understanding and spending so much time in these hills, and trust us that we're going to get the best results that are possible. And you just kind of got to trust us on that. And I urge you to one day get some tickets and check it out for yourself, and I guarantee you would have a much bigger appreciation for some of these lines, and you may understand where we came from and how we got to our decisions ultimately. So anyways, hope that clears some things up. If not, keep on sending out all the hate mail.